Can you help make that happen?
Yes,
How?
because I believe there's no one like you. And there never will be.
There is a strange, comforting illusion we cling to when we look at generational talent. We want to believe that true greatness is simply a divine gift that falls from the sky and lands on a chosen few. Because the alternative, admitting that unmatched brilliance is almost always forged in the fires of profound, inescapable trauma, is much harder to swallow. Biographical dramas have long struggled to map this causal relationship between a creator's private suffering and their public artistry. But Antoine Fuqua's 2026 blockbuster Michael takes this to a whole new level. It is one of the most financially successful music biopics in history, yet it suffers from a severe, almost uncomfortable cinematic dissonance. When I say this, I'm not exaggerating. It desperately tries to frame Joe Jackson as a one-dimensional, sinister villain, while inadvertently proving that his brutal utilitarian discipline was the undeniable forge of Michael's genius. And while it tries to paint Michael as a pure, innocent victim, it actually shows us a protagonist who selfishly abandons the very family structure that created him to build an empire of total isolation. I mean, of course I'll talk about all of these things in detail, but first, we need some context. Backed by a massive $200 million budget and the Jackson estate's strict approval, the movie intentionally cuts off its timeline in 1988 to avoid the devastating legal and moral complexities of Michael's later years. Because of this truncation, the film is forced to operate in a black and white moral universe. It paints Michael as a flawless, soft-hearted prophet burdened by a divine gift, while flattening his father, Joe, into a cartoonish swamp ogre. It completely strips away the sociopolitical realities of mid-century America that shaped Joe's harsh methods, utilizing him as a convenient scapegoat for all of Michael's adult insecurities, while failing to realize that the film accidentally validates those very methods. First of all, what's truly fascinating about this film is how it handles the mechanics of trauma and performance. Let's look at how the movie inadvertently proves that Joe's abuse was the engine of Michael's success. In the desaturated living room of their Gary, Indiana home, Joe implements a militaristic system where physical safety is directly tied to flawless execution. When a young Michael begs for a break from rehearsals, Joe responds by silently removing his belt while the rest of the family watches in quiet terror. This establishes a profound psychological baseline. The domestic sphere offers zero protection, and physical safety can only be purchased through absolute, perfect performance. This dynamic becomes even more apparent in the recording booth at Motown. The moment Joe's shadow looms outside the glass, the film's sound design completely severs the ambient studio noise, isolating Michael's pristine vocals. The performance becomes a desperate act of appeasement directed at the constant internalized surveillance of the patriarch. But look at what happens when Michael reaches adulthood. His iconic choreography is visually and sonically edited to mirror the sudden sharp violence of his childhood beatings. The whip-like crack of the snare drums and the sharp, aggressive foot stomps in sequences like Billie Jean demonstrate that Michael has sublimated the physical trauma of the belt into the exact percussive rhythms that define his global appeal. Without the crucible of his father's abuse, the film inadvertently proves Michael would have never developed the obsessive, militaristic drive required to subjugate the global pop market. Now, this is where the film's structural dissonance really starts to show. The script's dialogue actually positions Joe as a logical collectivist advocate who is desperately trying to build generational wealth and protect the group brand. He resists individual marriages and solo ventures because he knows a fractured act means financial ruin for the whole household. Yet the director systematically sabotages this dialogue through formalist manipulation. By shooting Joe from extreme, oppressive, low angles and cloaking him in high-contrast shadows, the camera artificially transforms a protective, working-class father into a predatory monster. The movie wants to frame Michael's solo success as a triumphant storybook emancipation, but his actions reveal a deeply stunted protagonist. Instead of facing his father directly, Michael fires Joe using a sterile corporate fax delivered by an attorney. This isn't a bold act of heroic liberation. It is the ultimate manifestation of emotional paralysis. By flattening his brothers into silent, interchangeable background props, the film exposes Michael's pursuit of singularity. During the victory tour, he uses the stage as an execution block, abruptly announcing his separation and leaving his family powerless in the wings. He completely abandons the cooperative relational network that built him, trading collective solidarity for an empire of isolated paranoia. Now, this moment is really important because there is one definitive structural climax where Joe's utilitarianism tragically and undeniably crosses the line into pure villainy: the 1984 Pepsi commercial accident. In the 1992 miniseries The Jacksons, An American Dream, this hospital bedside confrontation is handled with brutal honesty. Michael is lying in a burn unit with third-degree burns, and the existential threat of Gary, Indiana, is long gone. Yet Joe paces the room, refusing to look at his son's charred flesh, focusing entirely on stadium bookings and corporate contracts. When Joe demands that a heavily sedated Michael complete a 55-date tour, he prioritizes the corporate product over biological survival. He transitions into an agent of objective cruelty, exploiting his son's body to satisfy the market. However, the 2026 film drastically sanitizes this reality. It relies on a narrative of plausible deniability to shield the corporate sponsors from their severe negligence, using Joe as a convenient scapegoat while ignoring how the industry's systemic exploitation forced an injured artist into a lifelong cycle of chemical dependency. At the end of the day, Michael, 2026, suffers from its absolute refusal to sit in the moral gray. By resorting to devotional hagiography, it engineers a simplified, heavily sanitized fable that encases its subject in gold. The supreme tragic irony of the film is that in desperately trying to sever the artist from his trauma, it entirely misses the profound reality of their relationship. It presents Michael as a meek, perfect prophet while erasing his selfish isolation, and reduces Joe to a cartoonish tyrant while stripping away the sociopolitical realities that forged him. It fails to recognize the brutal symbiosis of a father and son who were inextricably trapped together in the devastating pursuit of perfection. So I have to ask you, does the film's decision to end its timeline in 1988 invalidate its authority as a biography, or is it a justifiable narrative boundary to focus purely on the construction of his musical peak? And by sanitizing the corporate negligence of the Pepsi accident to place the sole blame on Joseph Jackson, does this biopic protect the very industry machinery that ultimately destroyed the artist?